My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 42 years old, and I've been working as a financial analyst in New York City for nearly 2 decades. My life has always been surrounded by numbers, charts, and endless meetings. The company's office was on the 45th floor of a skyscraper on Wall Street, where the sun reflected off the windows and reminded us all that we were surrounded by power and ambition. I thought I had stability until everything crumbled in a single meeting. That morning, my boss, Mr. Anderson, entered the room with that cold and distant air of someone who had already made a decision. He didn't waste time on small talk. He simply announced that as part of the restructuring, my salary would be reduced by 62%. 62%, a sentence that sounded like a sharp cut to my life. As he spoke, my mind oscillated between disbelief and anger. I looked at my colleagues in the room. Some averted their eyes, others pretended to fiddle with spreadsheets as if it were just another statistic. No one dared react. There, in that glass tower, humanity had no value. The cut wasn't just financial. It was a direct attack on my dignity. I tried to keep my composure, but I felt my stomach churn. I was a divorced father with 2 teenage daughters, and my responsibilities went far beyond what those suited executives could imagine. They knew nothing about the sacrifices I made to keep my family afloat. I left the room feeling like the ground had vanished beneath me. The white, silent corridors now seemed like long, suffocating tunnels. Each step echoed as if the building itself were mocking my fragility. I knew that somehow this couldn't stand. Something inside me was awakening, something far beyond indignation. But in that instant, there was still a paralyzing shock. I sat at my desk, stared at the computer screen, and wondered, why me? I'd always delivered results, always been one of the most dedicated. It was as if the company had decided my life was just one more disposable variable in their profit equations. I opened the drawer and pulled out a photo of my daughters. I felt a mix of desperation and strength growing inside me. They were the reason for everything, and I couldn't let this cut turn me into a defeated man. As I took a deep breath, I realized that perhaps this humiliation was just the beginning of something bigger, something neither my boss nor the board could imagine. I didn't know how yet, but the idea of revenge began to form like a shadow in the back of my mind. That day, I learned that the greatest violence in the corporate world isn't what they take from you, but what they try to kill, your courage. And I wasn't willing to hand mine over so easily. That's how the flame ignited. A small but uncontrollable flame. I knew that somehow I'd turn that cut into a weapon, and the company that tried to break me would pay dearly for it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the office became suffocating. People moved like shadows, dragging folders and murmuring about the restructuring. The salary cuts had hit many, but none as brutally as mine. It was as if I'd been chosen as an example, a silent message sent to everyone else. I sat at my desk with a stack of reports to review, but every number reminded me of my own cut. I couldn't focus. The spreadsheet seemed to mock me, displaying profits and projections, while I mentally calculated how long I could support my daughters with what was left. Some colleagues approached discreetly, just to cast pitying glances. No one dared speak openly. The fear of retaliation was real. The company cultivated a culture where every employee was easily replaceable. In that environment, loyalty was nothing more than a pretty word used in motivational speeches. One afternoon, while having coffee in the break room, I overheard 2 managers whispering. They were talking about the pressure for the upcoming IPO. It was a crucial event for the company. Billions at stake, anxious investors, and reports that needed to shine, even if it was just for show. That's when something clicked in my mind. I knew the cut wasn't just about cost saving. No. It was part of a bigger plan. The company was cooking the books, sacrificing employees to inflate results and deceive investors. And if that was true, they'd just given me the greatest motivation of my life to dig deep. On the subway ride home, I mentally flipped through the latest reports I'd analyzed. Small discrepancies began to stand out in my memory. Figures that didn't add up, hidden lines, overly optimistic projections. The feeling was clear. Something was rotten, and I was about to uncover it. I arrived at my small apartment in Queens already decided. I opened my personal laptop and started reviewing confidential documents I copied as a precaution. It wasn't illegal yet, I told myself. It was just self-preservation. But I knew I was crossing a dangerous line. As I analyzed those spreadsheets, the world outside seemed distant. My cramped room, lit only by a desk lamp, turned into a silent war bunker. There, it was just me, my computer, and the burning desire for justice. Each new discovery fueled my determination. I wasn't just reacting to the salary cut. I was entering an invisible battle against a system that crushed people in the name of inflated profits. In that moment, I understood that my life would never be the same. The office silence had turned into a storm inside me, and I was ready to let it explode. I couldn't see those reports the same way. Every number seemed to carry a secret. Every chart hid a lie. I spent sleepless nights reviewing details that had previously escaped me, as if my brain had been awakened by something greater than myself. In one of those early mornings, I found the first clear evidence, a tampered quarterly report. Profit margins had been manually adjusted, masking absurd losses. That wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate fraud. My breathing quickened as I realized I was holding pure dynamite in my hands. I remember the phrase I'd once heard from a veteran colleague. If you really pay attention, you'll always find the cracks. You just need the courage to look deep. I was looking, and what I saw could topple not just my boss, but the entire board. That's when I found myself reflecting. How many stories like mine get buried, never told? How many professionals are crushed by companies that do everything to maintain a flawless facade? The truth is, this kind of revelation needs to be exposed. And if you follow my journey this far, maybe you should stick with me until the end. After all, what's about to happen next is something no one would ever dare to predict. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a new posture. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as someone holding a unique opportunity. I walked through the glass corridors, feeling like I carried a secret capable of shaking those structures. I sat at my desk and discreetly plugged in my USB drive to the computer. I copied strategic documents, and each mouse click felt like a step closer to the point of no return. I was becoming someone different, more bold, more cold, more calculating.
I looked at my reflection on the monitor. My face seemed more tired, but also more determined. It was as if at 42, I was finally discovering the true purpose of my career, not enriching corrupt companies, but exposing them. And inside me, the spark of revenge was no longer just a desire. It was a plan taking shape, ready to explode at the right moment. I just needed to wait for the perfect time to act. But the weight of the decision began to crush me. I knew that if I went all the way, there would be no turning back. I could lose my career, my reputation, and even custody of my daughters if everything went wrong. Fear, however, wasn't enough to stop me. In meetings, I looked at Anderson, my boss, and saw the cynicism etched into every word. He talked about market optimism and investor confidence, while I held proof that it was all a rotten charade. With every speech of his, my anger grew. My mind oscillated between two scenarios, staying silent, accepting my salary cut in my puppet position, or opening Pandora's box and letting the world see the hidden filth. It was a dilemma that consumed me. To relieve the pressure, I started writing in a notebook hidden in my drawer. In it, I detailed every step, every piece of evidence, like a war diary. With each filled page, my decision became clearer. I couldn't let them triumph. One night, leaving the building, I looked at the illuminated sign with the company's name shining against the Manhattan sky. That facade represented everything I hated: greed, lies, and arrogance. I felt the tightness in my chest, but also a strange sense of power. The power to destroy it all with a single email. That's when I realized the choice had already been made inside me. All that remained was the plan. And when the right moment came, I'd be ready to pull the digital trigger that would change that corporation's history forever. I met Claire on a rainy Tuesday when she dropped a stack of reports next to me. She was an internal auditor with tired eyes and a smile that hid exhaustion and caution. When we introduced ourselves, We exchanged few words, but there was recognition in her tone. Two people who knew too much. Gradually, between quick coffees in the break room, she started passing me information without fanfare. It was obvious she'd been hurt by the restructuring too, and that connected us. Claire brought me details I didn't see, meeting notes, short emails, and approvals for accounting entries. She spoke softly, always glancing over her shoulder like someone afraid even at home. I told her about the 62% salary cut and the discrepancies I found in the spreadsheets. She wasn't surprised. She just grabbed a notepad and started jotting down important names and dates. The alliance formed as naturally as cracks in old glass, slow, inevitable. She knew where the files were that I hadn't even imagined. With her authorization, I began obtaining digital copies of reports showing provision manipulations. Each new document was a punch to the gut. The web of lies was bigger than I dreamed. But at the same time, I felt relief, because now I wasn't alone in this. Claire brought pulse and care. I brought experience and a hard-to-tame will. Over the weeks, our relationship deepened into professional complicity. We talked at odd hours, cloaked in discreet gestures that only those who work in big companies understand. She warned me when someone from the board held off-hours meetings. I left false trails in reports, studying reactions, and opening gaps to extract more proof. Trust was a currency we traded with constant risk. One night, she handed me something that changed everything. An internal email with explicit instructions on accounting adjustments. The words were cold. Adjust provisions to improve quarterly appearance. Reading it was like receiving a treasure map and discovering the treasure was poison. I promised her we'd be careful, that every move would be calculated like a chess move. She nodded, eyes shining with fear and resolve, and I felt we were closer to the point of no return. But there were invisible costs. Claire told me she lived under constant pressure, reviews, 2 a.m. calls, and consultations with internal lawyers. She had family, a daughter in college, and the courage to keep involving me came with real fear. I thought of my daughters in Queens, and the fragility of the lives dependent on our decisions. Even so, we continued, because the feeling of allowing that fraud was worse than the risk. We planned small steps: copy, encrypt, and distribute. We'd use external servers, anonymous accounts, and journalistic contacts I was starting to probe. Claire taught me internal audit procedures that would help disguise our movements. In exchange, I promised to protect her if something went wrong, a promise that weighed on my soul. The partnership between us proved efficient, tactical, and human at the same time. One afternoon, she left me a discreet note. If something happens to me, be careful. Those words hit like a blow, and like fuel that pushed me to act with even more precision. I realized the danger was no longer abstract. It touched the people I had chosen to protect. The office seemed smaller, tighter, and every corridor now had invisible eyes. It was time to accelerate, but with the caution of someone who'd already tasted their own fall. Before I pulled the trigger, I felt the need to tell someone to follow the story, not to expose details, just to share that I was about to do something big. If you're following this narrative and want to see how it ends, subscribe to the channel. The journey continues, and sometimes discreet support makes all the difference. With the silent warning made, we returned to assembling the final dossier. Every file was checked twice, every digital route tested. Claire and I functioned like a duo with a dark and precise goal.
The IPO clock ticked louder each day, and we planned the perfect moment to act. And deep down, I knew the risk included not just my career, but the entire life I valued. From that point on, the company intensified surveillance. Small security tests, new authentication systems, and virtual patrols appeared out of nowhere. Someone had detected anomalies, and the building began to smell of corporate paranoia. Managers talked about operational risks in closed meetings, using terms that sounded like sentences. I felt we were walking through a minefield, and any wrong step would be fatal. Cameras seemed aimed at places they'd never been before. Emails were monitored with tools I barely understood, and logs were reviewed more frequently. The board hired an external consultancy to shield critical information before the IPO. Security guards circulated more through common areas, badges flashing like eyes. Everything indicated someone at the top suspected leaks or wanted to give that impression. Claire went days without speaking to me. Her eyes appeared cold and tired. She finally confessed she'd been called in for a talk with HR, and they feared for her position. The fear I saw on her face paralyzed me for a second, and then made me more resolute. I realized the fight wasn't just against numbers. It was against a machine built to protect those at the top, and the machine could crush anyone in its path. I started using alternative communication routes, coded messages in presentation files, USB drives hidden in book covers, short talks in the elevator line. I relearned the art of active silence, where every word was measured and every gesture planned. Nights of sleep became rare. My eyes burned from constant fatigue and nervousness, but adrenaline kept me focused like a surgeon in a complex operation. One day I received a strange alert on my personal email. Be careful. The message was short, no clear sender, and contained only a screenshot from a hallway camera. My breath faltered. It was proof we were being watched more closely than we had imagined. I began to distrust everything and everyone, including old allies who might have been blackmailed. The feeling of potential betrayal turned the environment into a board where all pieces could turn enemy. With the company's defenses enhanced, our movements had to become even more surgical. Claire and I divided tasks. She extracted documents, I created secure sending routes. Our plan depended on time and perfect synchronization, and art is only made with precision. The executive's proximity, market pressure, and sleepless nights made everything more tense. I felt the crushing responsibility not to fail, because failing meant annihilating lives and reputations. There was one night when we almost got caught. An analyst noticed my out-of-pattern access session. I had to justify it with a plausible excuse and speed up processes to avoid raising suspicions. That slip almost cost us everything. Claire cried from rage and relief at the same time. I realized we were getting closer to the abyss, and any noise could topple us. The line between success and catastrophe was narrowing dangerously. We then decided to create an anonymous account on a foreign server. The idea was to send everything in a single package at the right moment, protecting evidence in immutable copies. We tested the sending multiple times, simulating reactions from journalists and regulators. Each simulation made it clear the impact would be massive and our exposure inevitable. Still, we pressed on. The hour of the final click was approaching, and I felt the weight of the decision in every bone. Before the final phase, I had an honest talk with Claire about personal consequences. She told me that if something happened, we'd protect each other with everything we had. The promise sounded like a vow at the altar of our small rebellion. The next morning, I put on my suit like someone heading to a sentence and went to work with measured steps. The feeling was of walking into an inevitable duel, knowing the rain could erase both the trail and the destination. As I sat at my desk that morning, I watched the city outside. Manhattan seemed indifferent. Inside me, a mix of fear, determination, and sadness formed a compact cloud. I knew that from that day on, nothing would ever be the same. Not for me, not for Claire, not for the company. The clock marked decisive hours. The IPO was approaching, and we only had one chance to do the right thing. The next move would define everything, for justice, for revenge, or for complete ruin. I started gathering everything into a single dossier I called the final file. Each spreadsheet was renamed, every email saved as PDF, every recording numbered with dates. I worked deep into the night, with the building's cafeteria closed and Manhattan sleeping outside.
It was a digital weapon capable of destroying an entire power family. When I looked at the stack of evidence, I felt a mix of triumph and heaviness in my chest. I used external servers and encryptions I'd learned from obscure security forums. I created immutable copies that couldn't be deleted, distributing them across multiple anonymous clouds. I tested sending routes with fake proof files to ensure no internal log caught me. Every measure was designed to protect Claire and my daughters, even if I lost everything. Prudence became routine. Impatience, my constant enemy. Next, I sought out finance journalists who would accept anonymous material. I sent teasers without revealing names, just facts that could be independently verified. Some responded coldly, others requested meetings in discreet, safe locations. I felt we were mapping impact. The more reputable the outlet, the greater the damage. The morality of the action followed me, but the conviction to expose the truth outweighed the remorse. In the week leading up to the IPO, tensions in the office rose like an approaching storm. The board accelerated presentations, and Anderson walked with the confidence of someone who believed himself above it all. I, on the other hand, moved like an elephant in a china shop, aware of the damage I'd cause. Claire handed me the final files, and for the first time had tears she couldn't hide. I promised her that whatever happened, I'd handle the consequences with the same intensity. I also made physical backups, drives hidden in seemingly unimportant boxes. Each hiding spot bore the signature of a father who didn't want to bankrupt his daughter's future. I reviewed names, dates, and numbers 5 times, as if repetition guaranteed against human error. When I finished, I put the dossier in a black folder and took a deep breath, feeling the world spin. The sending time was mentally marked, minutes before market open.
The night before, I couldn't sleep. I walked the empty city and thought of all the lives it would touch. I knew there was a risk of innocent people suffering from the stock drop and market panic. Still, I believed truth was a greater good than the comfort of a guilty corporation. I returned home feeling like someone dropping a stone into a lake and watching the ripples follow. Morning would come, and with it the click that could change everything, for better or for eternal ruins. On the morning I was set to hit the button, I felt something was wrong with Claire. She took too long to reply to a simple message. Panic gripped my stomach hard. When I saw her in the hallway, her gaze was different. It was guilt, and beneath it, palpable fear. She whispered that she'd been called by HR and pressured. She revealed no more for fear of exposing us. My trust shook, and with it, the entire plan seemed as fragile as glass. Hours later, a rumor spread through the floor. Someone had seen an employee with a USB drive. Managers were summoned, and subtle questions began arising in short, cold meetings. I realized someone had betrayed our steps, or that the company's security had eyes I'd underestimated. The heat of fear brought back memories of my daughters and everything I could lose from one mistake. But the choice was already made inside me. Backing down was no longer a verb applicable to my situation. I tried to reorganize routes and delay the sending, but the IPO deadlines compressed our movements. I called Claire. The line dropped a few times, and at the end I heard only silence and static. In that pause, I understood the dimension of the exposure. Someone close to us had given in or been forced. The feeling of betrayal eroded my calm. I thought of all the faces around me who might have motives. The game turned personal. It was no longer just about corporate justice. It was about survival. Meanwhile, the company announced stricter internal audits and restricted accesses without justification. Logs began to be monitored in real time. Every move of ours became potential proof against us. I had to create plausible justifications for accesses and exits, staging normalcy under watchful eyes. Paranoia took over the corridors, and I noticed my breathing was already short and calculated. The tide of suspicion was rising, and we were fish swimming without knowing where the nets were placed. On a tense afternoon, I received an anonymous message. If you continue, they'll destroy what you love. The threat, raw and direct, tried to break me. I thought of my daughters, the Queen's apartment, what I risked from one mistake. But as I looked at the evidence again,
I felt there was no turning back. If not me, who else would denounce? The fury over the betrayal and the need to protect innocence in the market reignited my determination. The final decision needed to be made: click and expose, or back down and live with a trapped conscience forever. When I understood the betrayal came from a place I least expected, something inside me broke and aligned. The final choice was made not out of revenge necessity, but moral obligation in the face of irrefutable evidence. I prepared the final package with steady hands, wrapping the pain and betrayal in cold, precise discipline. If something went wrong, I knew the bill would be high, but I also knew there was no honorable alternative. With a clear head and heavy heart, I headed to my computer. The hour with a click was approaching. That early morning, Manhattan seemed quieter than ever. I felt the weight of the world on my chest. I reviewed the dossier one last time. Names, attachments, hashes of immutable copies, everything checked.
I set up the anonymous account on a foreign server, verified VPN routes, and prepared the send. Claire gave me a brief, encouraging smile, eyes swollen from poorly slept nights and contained fear. I promised myself that whatever happened, I'd done everything with surgical precision. I scheduled the send for 15 minutes before market open. The idea was to maximize shock. I'd like to say I didn't think of personal consequences, but images of my daughters followed me. I inserted the email with heavy attachments in a format journalists and regulators could quickly validate. I used direct words, clear evidence, and instructions for independent verification, nothing sensationalist. As I clicked send, I felt like I'd thrown a stone into a calm lake, watching the silence before the waves. I received automatic delivery confirmations, and then the small mental alarm. Now it's wait. Minutes dragged with the slowness of watching a bomb's countdown. I stayed at my desk, feigning normalcy, eyes fixed on the screen as if it could betray me. News began popping up in feeds from journalists who'd received the files for verification. In my chest, a mix of relief, fear, and a strange peace. The feeling of duty fulfilled, but costly. Soon Claire's phone buzzed. She looked at me with watery eyes and said simply, "They're opening it." The first outlets confirmed receipt and started public checks. Independent sources requested access. The noise grew, and I felt the speed of the corporate world shift gears suddenly. On the executive floor, faces that once rose with pride now sought explanations in false maps. I felt justice and revenge intertwined in a complicated knot that wouldn't leave me unscathed. The board met hastily. Calls were made to investors and lawyers, and the building breathed tension. Anderson appeared in front of the elevator with a pale face, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his posture. The shares to be sold in the IPO began to be questioned in chat rooms and trading desks. I stayed distant, watching the consequences I'd sown myself, aware of every possible loss. Even amid the tumult, an intimate sense of justice began to form in the hole left by fear. When the news broke, the impact was immediate. Suspensions, investigation requests, and withdrawal of releases. I saw journalists in the lobby with phones in their hand and felt we'd hit the heart of the problem. But with victory came the certainty I'd become a target, and targets are hunted. Still, in that instant, as the world reacted, I heard my inner voice tell me I'd done right. The price would be high, but the lie had been exposed to a light that could no longer be extinguished. The next day, the domino effect began to fall. Forensic analyses, interviews, and clarification requests. Journalists scoured every document. Regulators demanded emergency meetings and original copies. The company tried to react with rehearsed narratives, but the evidence was too compelling to circumvent. At the same time, a red line crossed me. I needed to know if all this was just part of the scheme. Digging deeper, I found a sequence of internal messages that made my blood run cold. The messages revealed that Anderson did know the IPO was built on illusions, and still went ahead. There were records of conversations with external consultants and clauses protecting executives from immediate liability. I also discovered that accounting adjustments had been authorized in discreet meetings intended to dazzle investors. The feeling of betrayal grew. It wasn't just about profit, but a conscious decision to deceive thousands. I realized my salary cut wasn't just cost saving, it was exemplary punishment for challenging the script. With that discovery, the crime's dimension expanded. It wasn't an error, it was collusion and premeditation. I sent the new messages to the journalists with extra anonymity and traceability precautions. At the same time, I realized Anderson wouldn't hesitate to turn the tables on us with lawsuits and defamation. The company began pointing fingers in our own ranks, and I already felt the first distant blow. Still, the truth advanced, and that, more than any security, gave me purpose and enough hate. In an improvised press conference, the board tried to deflect blame, but proof spoke louder than speeches.
Independent auditors began questioning practices and opening doors that had once been tightly shut. There were cascading firings, and well-known names began disappearing from public profiles and institutional pages. Meanwhile, my personal life began to tremble. Anonymous calls, visits to the building, veiled messages. I understood the counterattack would come strong, and protecting my family would require strategies beyond exposure. Anderson, desperate, made a move. He declared there would be lawsuits, insider leaks, and betrayal. The company launched an image campaign, accusation attempts, and a narrative needing a scapegoat. The first declared target was me, publicly labeled a disloyal employee in cold communiques. I realized the machine I'd activated now aimed all its legal and media cannons at me. Even under attack, I observed the stain on the corporation's reputation was already deep enough. By late afternoon, I felt the weight of victory, soaked in sacrifice. My career practically ceased to exist now. I thought of my daughters, school, debts, and felt the urgency to prepare shelter for them in the coming chaos. Still, something inside me remained firm, the certainty that the truth needed to be known. In front of a dark mirror, I saw a 42-year-old man with bags under his eyes and gaze older than his age. The journey continued. The exposure was just the beginning of a new battle I hadn't chosen, but would accept. On the eve of the IPO, I couldn't breathe in peace. I walked the illuminated streets of Manhattan, signs that seemed to mock me. I knew that in a few hours the corporate world would be in ecstasy over promises of billions, and I, just a 42-year-old man, held the power to turn that spectacle into tragedy. The dilemma wasn't just financial, it was moral, and it consumed me from within. I thought of Claire, her eyes full of mixed fear and courage. She trusted me, even after everything we'd been through, and the veiled threats surrounding her. I thought of my daughters, sleeping, unaware that their father might be destroying his own life. My heart weighed like lead. Each beat seemed to charge a high price for my choices. The future I envisioned was full of shadows, and yet it was the only one that seemed possible. I sat on a bench in a silent square and opened the notebook where I wrote my notes. I scribbled loose words: justice, revenge, truth, ruin. They all seemed valid, but none sufficient to express what was about to happen. I pulled out my phone and reread messages from journalists confirming they were ready to publish. It was like carrying dynamite in my pocket, with the fuse burning every second. At the apartment, I opened the window and let the cold dawn air in. I looked at the New York sky, tinged by artificial lights, and sought some sign of peace. But all I found was the reflection of my face, tired, aged, and determined. I was no longer just a betrayed analyst. I was a man about to alter the fate of thousands. And there was no turning back, just a narrow road leading to the final click. Before lying down, I left clear instructions in a hidden drive with passwords for trusted journalists. If something happened to me, the truth would still come out. It was a way to protect Claire and the evidence we'd risked so much to gather. I closed my eyes, but sleep never came. Only circular thoughts kept me awake. When the clock struck 5 a.m., I decided there was no more time for doubts.
I got up, put on my black suit, and straightened my tie in front of the mirror. I thought, today, you stop being an employee. Today, you'll become history. I grabbed my briefcase, laptop, and USB with the final copy. As I left the apartment, I took a deep breath, feeling the cold dawn air like a sentence. The world still slept, but I already carried the weight, awaken it by force. I arrived at the office before 7, when the building was still nearly empty. The corridors echoed solitary footsteps, and every closed door seemed to hide conspiracies. I sat at my desk, connected the laptop, and prepared the final send. The clock marked exactly 8:45. At 9, the market would open its doors in celebration. The world outside believed in a success spectacle, and I had another story to tell. The email was already written, with heavy attachments and detailed instructions. I took a deep breath, read it one last time, and clicked send.
A screen flashed and a code notification confirmed the send. Messages delivered to 12 recipients. It was like throwing a stone at the world's most expensive glass and waiting for it to shatter. I felt a strange calm, as if I'd fulfilled an inevitable destiny. The following minutes were an eternity. I pretended to work, but my eyes stayed fixed on discrete notifications. First, journalists confirmed receipt. Then, regulators sent automatic alerts. On the screen, I saw return emails with short phrases: received, check-in, confirming data. It was the prelude to a storm, and I was right in the eye of it. At 9 on the dot, the market opened, and almost simultaneously, the first report exploded. Headlines screamed on finance sites: IPO fraud, secret documents expose manipulation. The feed ignited like fire in dry grass, spreading doubts in seconds. I saw shares plummet even before the official announcement, investors in panic. And on the 45th floor, executives ran like ants in an attack colony. Claire appeared near my desk, pale but with a gleam in her eyes. She whispered, "They can't hold this back." And I knew she was right. The damage was irreversible. Journalists started live broadcasts, citing documents only we knew. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in real time, knowing I was the one who blew. Anderson entered the main room with the fury of a defeated general. He shouted orders, demanded silence, talked to lawyers and emergency plans, but no one truly listened. Everyone already knew it was too late. He glanced in my direction for a second, and in that look was suspicion. It was the first moment I felt my victory would come with direct persecution. As the news spread, the floor's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors demanded answers. Regulators required immediate meetings. Lawyers activated protocols. And I, standing there, was just a man who'd pressed a button.
The corporate world spun in collapse, and I watched like an invisible piece. In that instant, I realized nothing would be the same. Not for them, nor for me. Headlines flooded the Times Square screens, and I saw our brand become synonymous with fraud in minutes, as if years of propaganda were washed away by a black tide of incontestable facts. And each new article added fresh weight to the board's shoulders. On the trading floor, brokers shouted contradictory orders, trying to save what still had value, while I, motionless, felt the building's vibration reflect the outside turbulence. An earthquake made of clicks and algorithms. Regulators called a temporary suspension and requested original documents, and I knew they had cleaner copies than any corporate speech. Journalists wrote to me via anonymous channels asking if there was more, and the temptation to open everything at once competed with the prudence that still kept me alive. I looked at Claire, and in the silent nod we exchanged fit an entire story of risk, pact, and fear. The board met hastily, locking themselves in a glass room that no longer guaranteed inviolability, because public opinion pierces walls with the ease of a whisper, and the transparency of that corporate aquarium now seemed perfect irony. Anderson attempted an improvised statement, talking of procedural missteps and standard accounting reviews. But every word fell like counterfeit coin on Manhattan's wet asphalt. Questions grew harsher, and confidence melted live,
with reporters cross-checking data I'd prepared to be simple to verify and impossible to deny. Lawyers requested time, but time doesn't exist when truth meets network speed. I felt the wall clock tick like a hammer, syncopated to the chaos's rhythm. Meanwhile, my personal phone exploded in messages, some veiled congratulations, others alerts, a minority of raw hate, and in all was the realization that a line had been crossed with no return possible. My daughters stayed at their mother's for safety, and I disabled predictable travel routes, swapping subway for cash-paid taxis, trying not to become a human headline leaving the building. Security received orders to watch accesses, but I already had my shortcuts and a new habit of checking reflections in windows before turning corners. Claire advised me not to use the work phone under any circumstances, and I obeyed like someone obeying a skydiving instructor at 2,000 feet. There, heroism was just discipline. The company tried to retake its own narrative with polished communiques, but the outlets were already telling another version, that of spreadsheets speaking for themselves, command chains validating adjustments, tight deadlines justifying the unjustifiable. Institutional investors announced immediate reassessments, and financial influencers dismantled defenses in videos racking up millions of views in hours. I saw employees in the lobby crying, and others furious, the human pain that always accompanies the fall of the mighty, and for the 1,000th time I wondered if there was a path without damage. I found none, only the certainty that in a systemic lie, anesthesia is broad and surgery inevitable. The IPO was officially suspended. When I stepped out to breathe, I found the cutting late afternoon air and the smell of rain on the Hudson, a reminder that the city never pauses to mourn a corporate disaster. In an anonymous cafe, I replied to a reporter, "Verify everything. Don't trust me, trust the data," and sent an extra checksum to shield authenticity, because truth without proof becomes disposable legend. The barista turned on the TV, and I saw myself reflected on the screen without appearing in the news, and that was enough to return me to the invisible mode that had brought me this far. Victory had the texture of cold steel, smooth and dangerous, and I knew the counterstrike was already underway. I returned to the office through a side entrance and found the desk phone blinking like an alert lighthouse. I answered and heard Anderson's breath before his voice, a pause worth a treatise on defeat and resentment. He said my name like signing a sentence, promising lawsuits, private investigation, full cooperation with regulators, and a venomous reminder that everything has consequences. And I replied with calculated silence, the weapon of someone who'd already spoken enough in the right places. I hung up with steady hands, because the train was already in motion, and there's no handbrake for gravity. Claire found me in the hallway and whispered, "Tomorrow will be worse," and I knew she was right, because Monday markets always charge with interest. I tucked the notebook into my jacket and prepared to pay each installment of what I'd started. The next morning, my name appeared in an internal communique as employee under investigation for breach of confidentiality. And that phrase, so clean, hid an attempt to reduce me to the convenient label that absolves structures and condemns people. I received immediate suspension notification, an elegant invitation to the exit door, and realized the theater needed a human villain to lighten the plot's weight. Company lawyers sent harsh letters, trying to surround me with steel language, and I responded with what I had: audit trails, digital signatures, chains of custody. My job was already dead. All that remained was to save the truth's narrative. Claire was called to HR 3 times and emerged from meetings with trembling hands but eyes still ablaze, a type of courage that only blooms when dignity is at stake. She said she might need to step away for health reasons, and I read in the quotes a minimal survival strategy, a breather to avoid being ground in the meat grinder of a reputation crisis. I offered part of my savings for her lawyer, and she refused with a sad smile, asking only that I not make impulsive moves. I promised, and I knew I was lying a little, because crisis has its own clock. We left through different doors, like agents leaving the field after the blast. Anonymous calls came at night, some threats, others bargains, all with the same smell of panic trying to pass as control. And I adopted new routes, cheap and quiet hotels, names that weren't mine. I talked to a whistleblower protection NGO, listened to dry advice on documentation, media, and personal security, and realized the manual I didn't want to read was now my bedside book. My daughters asked if I was okay, and I said yes, but the word yes has many layers when you're a father and a man in free fall. In every window of the rented room, I sought not faces, but intentions.